I never thought a simple train ride would change me forever. It was late, way past midnight, and I was the only one at the small station on the edge of town. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the empty platform. I'd missed the last regular train and was about to call a cab when I heard the distant rumble of wheels on tracks. Strange. According to the schedule board, no more trains were due tonight. The train that pulled in was old. Not vintage charming old, but worn down old. The metal exterior was dull, and some windows were covered with what looked like newspaper from the inside. Still, I needed to get home, and this unexpected train seemed like my only option. As I stepped aboard, the first thing I noticed was the smell, musty and stale, like old books left in a damp basement. The second thing was the silence. Trains usually hum with noise, the air conditioning, the subtle vibration of movement, people talking. This one was eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of metal. "Ticket," a voice rasped, making me jump. The conductor stood behind me, though I hadn't heard him approach. He was tall and thin, with skin that looked too tight across his face. His uniform was outdated, like something from the 1950s, and slightly too big for his frame. "I don't have one," I admitted. "How much do I owe?" He stared at me with watery eyes that never seemed to blink. "No charge tonight. Special service." His voice had an echo to it, though we were in a narrow corridor. I thanked him and moved into the main carriage, feeling his eyes on my back long after I'd walked away. The carriage wasn't empty as I'd expected. About a dozen people sat scattered throughout, none sitting together. They all looked up when I entered, their eyes following me as I walked down the aisle. I chose a seat near the middle, not wanting to sit too close to anyone. Across from me sat an old woman knitting something that didn't look like any pattern I recognized. Her needles clicked rhythmically, but the yarn she used was strange. It seemed to shift colors in the dim light, and I couldn't quite focus on what she was making. "Beautiful night for a journey," she said without looking up, her fingers never stopping their work. "Don't get many new faces on this route." "I missed my regular train," I explained, trying to sound casual. "Lucky this one came along." "Lucky," she repeated, and I noticed her mouth didn't quite match the movement of her words. "Yes, some would call it that." Before I could ask what she meant, a man 2 rows ahead turned around to face me. He wore a business suit that might have been expensive once but now looked worn at the elbows. His tie was perfectly straight, though, and his hair was slicked back with so much product it looked wet. "First time?" he asked, his voice surprisingly deep for his small frame. I nodded, increasingly uncomfortable with all the attention. "I remember my first time," he said, smiling to reveal teeth that seemed too small for his mouth. 15 years ago now, or maybe 20. Time works differently on this line." He laughed as if he'd said something funny, then turned back around abruptly. The train lurched forward and I grabbed the seat to steady myself. Through the window I could see we were passing through areas I didn't recognize. We should have been heading toward the city center, but instead, we seemed to be moving through an industrial area I'd never seen before, full of abandoned factories with broken windows. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8, skipped down the aisle. She wore a school uniform that looked decades out of style and her hair was in perfect braids. She stopped at my seat. "You smell like the outside," she said, wrinkling her nose. "I just came from there," I replied, unsure how else to respond. "I remember outside," she said thoughtfully. "The sun was warmer then." She continued skipping down the aisle before I could ask what she meant. The train entered a tunnel and the lights flickered, plunging us briefly into darkness. When they came back on, a man was sitting beside me who hadn't been there before. He wore a conductor's uniform similar to the first man's, but his cap was pulled low over his eyes. "Don't mind the others," he said quietly. "They've been riding a long time. They forget what it's like to meet someone new." "Where exactly is this train going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Wherever you need to go," he replied, which wasn't an answer at all. I noticed his hands then. The fingers were unusually long and he was missing a nail on his index finger. A dark stain that might have been oil or might have been something else marked his sleeve. "I just need to get home," I said firmly. "Home," he repeated as if testing the word. "Yes, we all want to go home eventually." The train slowed, and through the window, I saw we were approaching a station I recognized. My stop, though it looked different somehow. The lights were dimmer and the usual crowd of late-night travelers was missing. "This is me," I said, standing quickly. The conductor stood too. "Are you sure? Many passengers find it comfortable to stay aboard. The journey is the destination, after all." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I moved past him toward the door, aware that everyone in the carriage was watching me again. The old knitting woman called after me. "Next time, bring a ticket, dear. Those who ride for free often pay in other ways." I stepped off onto the platform, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. The train doors closed behind me, and it pulled away silently, much more quietly than any train should move. I stood watching until it disappeared into the distance, then looked around. The station was familiar but wrong somehow. The signs were older versions, the paint a different color than I remembered. It took me an hour of walking to find my way home, though it should have been a 10-minute walk. My building looked the same, but my key didn't work at first, as if the lock had changed slightly. When I finally got inside and checked my phone, I had 17 missed calls from my roommate. According to her, I'd been missing for 3 days, not the few hours I'd experienced. I never take the train anymore. I'd rather walk, no matter the distance, no matter the weather. Because sometimes I look down at the tracks and see that old train in the distance, moving silently along routes that aren't on any map. And I know the conductor is watching for me, waiting for me to need a ride home just one more time.